For the last 32 days, I've been under house arrest. I've been unable to leave my home except for the occasional COVID test. I've been under a strict lockdown here in Da Nang, Vietnam, unable to leave for any reason. I can't even go grocery shopping. Instead, food, medicine, and other necessities have been distributed door to door by the government and by volunteers. If we have any special needs, we're supposed to contact our local commune administration to make arrangements, and a national hotline has been set up for people to call if they're experiencing any hardships due to the pandemic. This is in stark contrast to most of 2020 and the beginning of this year. Vietnam enjoyed complete COVID containment and blissful normalcy for most of that time. While my friends back in the USA were under lockdown or having to go to work and risk getting infection, a lot of them did get infected, I was able to travel, go to restaurants, and live a normal life without any fear because there were zero community cases. Delta has changed all that. The measures that were so successful in Vietnam for the first year and a half of the pandemic just haven't been effective against this ultra contagious variant. Over the last few months, there's been a terrible outbreak in the South, and that variant has crept up northwards to lesser but still concerning extent as well. There's no doubt about it. The Delta variant sucks and can kiss my ass, and it's taking monumental efforts to contain. The medical system of Vietnam has been severely strained, with doctors and nurses being recalled from retirement and shuttled down en masse from the north to deal with the outbreaks in the south. Social services are also being put to the test. In Ho Chi Minh City, the military has been mobilized to distribute food and supplies all across the city. Here in Da Nang, local authorities have been setting up food stores and free delivery of free food and other necessities in every district. The response hasn't been perfect, and indeed it's been quite challenging for the authorities, with many setbacks and stumbles along the way. There have been mistakes, but from my perspective, it's been quite an impressive response nonetheless, with every sector of society mobilizing to contain the disease. Finally, now the virus seems to be coming under control, with the curve not just flattened, but receding even in the south where things have been at their worst. Here in Da Nang, we're down to between 0 and 5 community cases per day over the last week or so, and green zones where there have been 0 cases for over 2 weeks will gradually be going back to normal over the next few weeks. Life may be resuming normalcy once again here, and I definitely feel like there is almost no risk of me getting COVID at this point. Meanwhile, back in the USA, there are no such restrictions. Folks are going out to bars, they're traveling, they're hosting huge parties. Even Barack Obama and AOC have been cutting it up en masse, even as the death toll hovers at around 2,000 per day, despite about half of the population in the USA being vaccinated. Vietnam, of course, hasn't had nearly as much vaccine coverage so far, thanks to vaccine imperialism and other problems. So really, it's quite remarkable that Vietnam still has one of the lowest COVID death rates in the world at just 169 deaths per 1 million, despite being a very densely populated country. By comparison, the USA has a death rate of 2,072 deaths per million, more than 12 times higher per capita than Vietnam, even though Vietnam is a poor developing country and the USA is the richest country on earth. The people of Vietnam have only been able to turn the tide against the Delta variant through tremendous sacrifice. There are not as many resources here, especially vaccines. So really, it's taken lockdowns to combat the disease. And that leads to the question, has it been worth it? Are strict lockdowns and other such coercive measures justified? Last week, I did a video in which we discussed the nature of hierarchy. This week, we're taking a look at coercion, the forms it can take, and the many ways it can manifest in human society. So first, let's define coercion. Simply put, a coercive act is one which forces a human being to do something they don't want to do. Anarchists like me want people to have as much freedom as possible, and thus the anarchist position is highly skeptical of the use of coercive force. Of course, coercion can take many forms. Often it takes the form of violence. If you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to hurt you. Now, obviously, sometimes violence is necessary to prevent further violence, such as killing in self-defense or enslaved people rising up violently against their masters to free themselves. Rebellion! Obviously, that kind of coercive force is okay. So we can't just say that no coercive force is ever justified under any circumstances. Sometimes we have to coerce others into not coercing us, if that makes sense. So we have to find a way to navigate the complexities of coercion and using force to make other human beings do things that they don't want to do or not do things that they want to do. So when is it acceptable to use coercive measures against our fellow human beings? That is the big question, I think, of anarchism. In the USA, the wealthiest nation on earth, we have more than enough food to feed every human being, and yet 1 in 7 Americans suffer food insecurity and rely on food banks to survive. We thus have a stunningly high malnutrition death rate, with about 1 death by malnutrition per 100,000 people, a rate that matches many, many poor developing countries, a rate that's 60 times higher per capita than Vietnam's, in case you were wondering. I'd argue that every single one of these deaths due to malnutrition in the wealthiest country on earth is death due to systemic social violence. If someone is starving in a country as rich as the USA, a society that has a massive surplus of food, and we fail to feed them, then that constitutes a violent withholding of material needs on a systemic level. And this violence stems from hierarchy and coercion. Hungry people are barred from taking food which they can't pay for from capitalist shops by the police and other agents of state violence, a form of hierarchical coercion. You can't have that food, and if you try to take it to feed yourself, you're either going to die, go to prison, you're getting in trouble. In order to solve this problem, we would need to forcefully redistribute food, a coercive act. Most millionaires and billionaires don't want their wealth to be redistributed in any way, shape, or form. If Jeff Bezos wanted to give up his wealth, he could solve world hunger and still have billions of dollars of wealth left to spare right now. But he'd rather use that money, which he robs from his workers, to fly around in space. So that's just not going to happen, at least not voluntarily. So the thing is, there's no solution to this kind of inequality that isn't going to involve coercive force of some form or another. There's nothing we can do without seemingly contradicting our own abhorrence of coercive force some way or another. The truth is, every relationship contains coercive elements. There's no social relationship between human beings that can exist without any coercion whatsoever, and thus the total elimination of coercive force is an impossible ideal. So why do I say that coercion is unavoidable in human society? Well, it's because humans are so diverse. We have so many diverging needs and goals. Our wills come into conflict with each other all the time, and we often need or want each other to do things that we don't want to do. Throughout your day, you probably coerce the people around you in subtle ways, often without even realizing it. Say your friend wants tacos for lunch and you want pizza. One of you is going to have to coerce the other into eating something the other doesn't want to eat. If your roommate wants you to wash the dishes because it's your turn, but you want to keep playing PUBG, one of you is going to end up coercing the other into doing something they really don't want to do. Or you're going to have a nasty sink full of dishes, probably going to get roaches. Make sure you wash your dishes, folks. Little anarchist pro tip. The point is, coercion is sometimes unavoidable, and sometimes we have to accept a lesser coercion to prevent a greater and more violent form of coercion from taking root. What we can strive for is the minimization of the use of force and coercion as much as possible over time. We can root out harmful systemic coercion and dismantle it. Even if we can't eliminate it entirely, we can seek to eliminate it to the extent possible. And this, to me, is the goal of anarchism. Even though we know we can never get rid of hierarchy and coercion altogether, we can strive to increase human liberty more and more over time. As the anarcho-syndicalist writer Rudolf Rocker said, "I'm an anarchist not because I believe anarchism is the final goal, but because there is no such thing as a final goal." So what does any of this have to do with COVID and lockdowns? Well, let's see. If I walk up to you and inject you with a syringe filled with Ebola virus, I'm pretty sure you would take that as a violent act. If I know I have COVID and I walk up to you and cough in your face on purpose, I'm pretty sure you'd also take that as a violent act, and you wouldn't be too happy about it. Exposing someone to harmful contagions without consent is a harmful, violent act, and the key word here is without their consent. That's several words, but that's the key words. In the USA, millions of people have been exposed to COVID under circumstances which are blatantly non-consensual since the beginning of 2020. Obviously, some accidents and such are avoidable, but also a lot of those infections in the USA, most of them, were avoidable. Perhaps if COVID weren't so deadly, or if everyone in the USA were healthy and had full health coverage and material security, this wouldn't have been such a big deal. But given that nearly 1 million Americans have died so far, yes, 1 million, look at this recent study, I'd say we have to take a closer look at the question, what means are justified by the present situation? COVID hits human populations unevenly, like all disease. For every white person in the USA that gets COVID, 7 indigenous people are infected. Black people have lost 3 years from their lifespans collectively per person. Latina people have lost 2 years from their lifespans. And of course, the disabled, immunocompromised, and elderly are far more likely to die or suffer debilitating complications from COVID than younger, healthier people. And the wealthy obviously have much better access to resources to prevent getting infected and to survive. Just look at the ways in which Joe Rogan and Donald Trump, when they got infected, were able to afford really, really expensive treatments that most people could never afford. Hundreds of thousands of the people who have been exposed to COVID in the USA have been immunocompromised, elderly, disabled, or they just don't have healthcare coverage. In other words, they're at the short end of the hierarchy stick in the USA, and this makes them more susceptible to the coercive effects of being exposed to the disease without consent. They are more likely to suffer worse violence from infection. A healthy 22-year-old might be perfectly comfortable with taking the risk of being exposed to COVID, while the exact same exposure to the exact same disease would be a virtual death sentence for a 65-year-old lung cancer patient who's allergic to the vaccine and doesn't have health care. This constitutes a hierarchy, a social contradiction between the realities of healthy people and wealthy people and poor and unhealthy people. Similar contradictions exist along class lines, of course. When the pandemic first broke out, wealthy capitalists fled to bunkers and other safe havens where they could remain indefinitely to wait things out, see how it goes. Meanwhile, poor workers were forced to choose between showing up at work for minimum wage without proper protective equipment, paid sick leave, or sufficient health care coverage, or staying at home and losing their income, which would expose them to hunger and homelessness. Another magnificently horrifying social contradiction. Now, here in Vietnam, the impacts of these contradictions, which do exist in Vietnam, it's not a perfect, completely egalitarian society, but the impacts of those hierarchies have been minimized primarily through lockdowns and quarantines, which have kept the number of COVID deaths to just 35 individual cases all through 2020. Now, living through those lockdowns, they sucked. And the big month-long marathon lockdown we just are having now sucks big time. I'm not happy about losing my freedom to go out and enjoy the world. It's boring, it's depressing, it sucks. But let's think about the alternative. What if there were no lockdowns in Vietnam? The entire nation of Vietnam only has about 300,000 hospital beds, and even with strict lockdowns, the medical system has been stretched to its limitations. Again, doctors and nurses have been called out of retirement. They've had to bring army doctors down from Hanoi to the south. They're having to really, really stretch their limited resources as far as possible during the massive breakout in Ho Chi Minh City and other southern cities. If the virus were left unchecked in those densely populated cities, some of the most densely populated cities in the world, it would wreak havoc on Vietnam, which is one of the most densely populated countries on earth. The material conditions, 100 million people living densely together. I'm going to keep saying that. It's a very dense country without vaccines in this poor developing country with a limited supply of hospital beds and very few vaccines must be taken into account when we consider what means are appropriate to combat the pandemic. So we have what Derrida called an aporia. I have a whole video on that if you want to watch it. A situation with no clear, perfect solution. No matter what happens, it's going to suck. The essence of a subject defines its true nature. I got to get a highlighter. Let's talk now about essence and phenomena. The essence of a subject defines its true nature, while phenomena are just things we observe in relation to the subject. And sometimes the phenomena we observe give insight into the essence of a subject, but often they don't, or they're even misleading. For example, the way I see it, this highlighter is essentially orange. Okay, the color it makes when you mark it on paper is orange. And if you ask me for an orange highlighter, this is the one I'd hand you. But that said, it has some phenomena which betray this essence. For one thing, it has this black cap. And if I presented the highlighter to you like this, you wouldn't know anything about the essence of the highlighter, right? You'd only have the phenomenon of the black cap to go on. And I wouldn't blame you for guessing that this was a black marker, but you would be essentially wrong. You would be mischaracterizing this object. Phenomena can be deceptive and misleading. The lockdowns in Vietnam certainly have many phenomena of oppression. Barriers have been thrown up all over these cities. People are patrolling around to make sure we don't leave our homes without permission. I am literally being confined to my home, and it does feel pretty friggin' oppressive. Seriously, when I went out to get groceries yesterday for the first time in 31 days, I felt like I was doing something wrong. I felt like I was breaking out of prison or something. It feels really bad. But in essence, we have to remember that these measures are only temporary, while death and disability to COVID are permanent. In essence, these lockdowns are meant to prevent death and disability for thousands upon thousands of people. In that sense, they are essentially protecting the immunocompromised and the elderly and the unvaccinated and the vulnerable from being coercively exposed to the Delta variant without consent. Killing someone is the ultimate act of coercive force. It is irreversible. When you make another human being die, you are completely robbing that person of all freedom of action permanently forevermore. So really, which scenario to you seems to be the bigger contradiction against personal liberty? Having everyone restricted for movement for a matter of a few months, or having thousands, perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of people die permanently forever? To me, in the specific context of Vietnam, the answer is obvious. Demanding that thousands of old, sick, and disabled people and poor people just die without their consent, when that could be prevented just so capitalists can enjoy higher profits, is, to me, essentially authoritarian as hell. And I'm glad to live in a country where the people are collectively more concerned with preventing mass death of vulnerable people than with the mere aesthetic phenomena of freedom for the healthy and privileged, and above all, the capitalist class at the expense of those vulnerable and marginalized people. Right now, in the USA, people are given the illusion of freedom through the phenomena of being allowed to travel and congregate at the expense of the essential freedom for hundreds of thousands of people to be alive. To me, this is a microcosm of capitalism in general. Capitalism is a system which gives us the illusion of freedom through the phenomena of choosing our employer and so on, when really we are faced with the coercive choice of either working for a capitalist's profits or starving to death. I have a whole video on why it's not possible for everyone to become a capitalist. If you have any reservations about that notion, you can check it out, links in the description. Now, does this mean that I think the USA should copy Vietnam exactly and just do everything Vietnam did? Well, I don't even think it would be possible for the USA to institute the same measures as Vietnam right now. The material conditions and social systems are just so completely different between the USA and Vietnam. That seems like an absurd proposition to me. I mean, yeah, ideally, I would have loved for the USA to lock everything down and protect everybody, but could that actually have happened in 2020? So to say that the USA should just mirror Vietnam's actions completely would, to me, be an idealist position. It's a position that I kind of took early on when I was panicked and I really wanted my friends and family to be safe, and I really wanted the USA to do what Vietnam was doing, but just wasn't going to happen. It's easy to brainstorm about hypothetical situations, what would have been preferable, what might be nice in an ideal world, but we are unfortunately tied down to this material reality which we inhabit. So I can only uphold Vietnam as an example that these things are possible, but you have to have the right material conditions, which includes those objective social relations. You have to have the right cultural hegemony in place before you can even hope to protect the vast majority of the population from a disease like this. And the USA isn't geared up to protect the people in the way that Vietnam has been. The USA isn't socially organized like Vietnam is, with coordination already in place at the street, neighborhood, and district level. It was like that even before the pandemic broke out here in Vietnam. They had those mechanisms in place. They had plans in place. They had resources in place for an event like this. And when the pandemic broke out, all those mechanisms sprung into action. The material conditions were wildly different than they were in the USA. Certainly, I doubt that the system of universal food distribution would have been set up in the USA. I mean, we have had food distribution in the USA, but it hasn't been in coordination with the state very much at all. It's mostly been grassroots mutual aid activities. I doubt corporations would have been willing to just shut down for months on end without profits coming in just to save the lives of their employees. What do you think is more important to a capitalist, the lives of their employee or those profits? I think the answer is obvious. And by the way, even if an individual capitalist wanted to protect their employees and wanted to give up those profits, well, guess what? One of their competitors would be more ruthless and put them out of business. That's what Marx saw as the downside of that invisible hand that guides the economy. It doesn't matter what your personal morality is. The market is going to dictate what you're forced to do, or else you're going to go out of business and your competitor is going to eat your lunch. That's one of the things that sucks about capitalism. Wherever you are in the world, it's up to you to sort out how best to respond to COVID and all the other problems which are facing us right now. You're going to have to look at your local material conditions and figure out what's possible, what isn't, and then decide what means are justified by your circumstances. Then you got to figure out how to get from where you are to where you want to end up. As for me and my situation here in Vietnam, as far as lockdowns go, I don't feel like a hypocrite at all, being an anarchist who says, I'm glad that I've been a prisoner in my own home for over a month, and I would much rather be essentially free here from death and disease, and of course to have my neighbors and all the other people in this nation free from death and disease, while negotiating these inconvenient phenomena of lockdowns, which may seem oppressive. I much prefer that to what I would be facing if I were in the USA, where people are enjoying the phenomena of illusionary freedom, even as thousands of vulnerable, marginalized, and poor people are essentially victims of mass murder by pandemic through the genocidal negligence of the free market. There's a lot of questions to be asked about this. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I'm glad to be here in Vietnam, and I worry a lot for my friends and family back in the USA. I'm EJ, this is Non-Compete, and if you want to learn more about the situation here in Vietnam, please check out my partner Luna Oi's channel. Right now, she's releasing her vlog of the lockdown, and you can learn all about what we've been experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Also, I hope you'll check out our Stream Highlights channel, where we just put out a 3-part series on Marxist morality, and it touches on a lot of the themes we've discussed here today. Links are in the description. Thanks to everyone who's supporting us on Camaraderie. Y'all are super rad. You're the reason we can do this, as well as our Patreon supporters. Thanks to everyone who watches this show. Please share the links because the algorithm hates us. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Đó chính là anh Aaron Johnson. Và anh chính là một người Mỹ đang sống tại thành phố Đà Nẵng. Anh là một nhà làm phim tự do, một YouTuber chuyên quay các clip chia sẻ về cuộc sống thú vị tại Việt Nam với khán giả quốc tế. Hi Aaron.
Hello.
It's a very pleasure to meet you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and how long have you been to Vietnam?
I first moved here in 2013, so it's been almost, I guess, about 9 years.
So you have received the support from the community?
Yeah.
And how about the local authority?
Yeah, we have I guess the street leader in our neighborhood is great. Actually, before the lockdown, we met him we knew him, but we really talked to him because of the election, and my wife went to go vote. And it's just so interesting because we don't have anything like that in the USA, but he came to our house and he said, this is the day that you vote, this is where you go vote, and gave her all the instructions. So that's when we kind of got to know him. And then through the pandemic, he's given us information, he's been checking in on us, he gave us information if I need to talk to somebody in English. So I have I haven't had to use that, but if I had a problem, I could contact somebody with the Da Nang administration that speaks English. So yeah, it's been really great. I mean, I got tested 3 times now with the one door one test campaign. Fortunately, no COVID so far. So yeah, but it's been I feel like I've been a part of the community. Yeah.
Is there any distinction between the locals and foreigners?
Well, I live in Lien Chieu, and it's a very working class Vietnamese neighborhood. It's like fishermen and bus drivers, and I'm the only foreigner that I ever see. I never see any other foreigners. I haven't seen another foreigner since before the lockdown. But everyone's been very welcoming to me. Our neighbors again have been very kind and caring about me and trying to make sure that I'm okay. But right before the lockdown, it was one of the last days that we could go to a grocery store and go shopping. Yeah. And we went to a little street vendor that was selling vegetables, and they were very worried about me and gave my wife some extra vegetables for free. So yeah, it's been a really great experience, and I feel like people treat me like part of just like anybody else in the community. So.
Vâng, cùng với những hỗ trợ từ chính quyền địa phương và cộng đồng dân cư thì có lẽ hơn hết vẫn là sự thông cảm và chấp hành của chính những người nước ngoài đang sống tại Việt Nam.